Hello again. The video cut out because we had exceeded the allowed time limit. So I was just in the middle of saying that the preceding video, is a summary of. Hopefully, you find that clear. It's everything that you were expected to do to complete your semester. What you're supposed to do, when you're supposed to do it. You will find, yeah, and I wanted to say that you will also find this information in the email that you will have received. I say today on this. Here we are on the. Oh, it's on the 8th of April. Okay, so now I want to move on to one last grammatical point to kind of fully, I would say, to sort of really fully go through relative clauses. Now, there was a delicate point in distinguish, as I've just mentioned in the previous video, a delicate point, distinguishing between relative and appositive clauses, right? But we're going to use this board here. But there would say there's another delicate point, and this has to do a lot to do with the function of relative clauses. Now, if you remember, the difficulty in distinguishing between an appositive clause and a relative clause is that they both have the same, typically, right? They both typically have the same function, namely that they're both post modifiers in noun phrases. And that's something that might be difficult to apprehend because, as we have stated, both appositive clauses and relative clauses are clauses, meaning they're verbal structures. And as a verbal structure, they can contain essentially a sentence worth of information. And we can usually create a sort of equivalent sentence to a relative clause or an appositive clause, right? So it might seem difficult to apprehend the fact that we can kind of fit a sentence into a noun as a post modifier, right? And this is part of what we call, noun phrase expansion, right? Hopefully that should be clear, right? Now, the caveat that we should add to that is that there are, in addition to these are sort of the typical relatives, and what we saw was that there is an important distinction between what we call defining relative clauses and non-defining relative clauses, right? Which has to do, usually it's the punctuation kind of tip you off. Now, both of these are post modifiers in a noun phrase, right? But as we said, if we have a comma, right, we will say that immediately following the head noun, right? This means that there is this marks a change in intonation, right? And this indicates that the relative clause that follows the comma, right, is going to be giving non-essential information, meaning information that serves to identify the head noun. So this information is going to be sort of considered to be parenthetical, right? It's sort of an aside. That's one way to think of it. So it's important to note that even when that is true, even when we have a non-restrictive relative clause, right? Even if we get the feeling that we are just giving extra information that is sort of without the scope of the noun phrase, it is still a post modifier for that noun phrase, meaning that it is still contained within the noun phrase. And that is not so obvious. This is something I actually mentioned when we saw each other in class, but I want to remind you of that. So this is to say that up until now, right, with relatives, right, whether they be defining or non-defining relatives, their function, right, has been to be a post modifier of the noun phrase, meaning that they're contained within the structure of that noun phrase. Okay. So with that in mind, we're going to look at something that is a little bit different. We can consider these to be non-prototypical relative clauses, and they're what we call sentential relatives, right? And just so you know, there's one of these in the test. You'll find, as you're hopefully the practice test that I've sent you, you're going to find one of these in the section where you identify structure and function of subordinates. So here we have, I have to erase this. This is going to be a little bit, please hold on just one second. I heard it. Oh, here it is. Thank you for waiting. So I needed to erase the board. Needed to be a special eraser here. So as I was saying, we're moving on to sentential relatives, right? Or you could say sentence. They're also referred to as sentence relatives, right? And this has something to do with what we call the scope of the relative. And sentence relatives are not post modifiers and noun phrases. So they're exceptional in that respect, right? So that means they're going to have a different function. They're still relative clauses, right? But they have a different function. Now, as we've seen before, as if I say, for example, the woman who is walking down the street, we have who is walking down the street is going to be the structure of that. It's going to be a relative clause, right? And we've seen that, yes, it is a post modifier in the noun phrase, the woman who is walking down the street, right? And it bears on the head noun, which is woman, right? We're saying something about that woman, right? Okay, that means the scope of that relative clause is going to be the head noun, the woman, right? Which means that's another way of saying that it is contained within that noun phrase. It's part of that noun phrase, right? So usually the scope of a relative clause is going to be a noun, and namely the head noun of which the relative clause is the post modifier. Okay, and that should be pretty clear, right? Now what happens with this sentential relative is, when we say the scope of the relative clause, the head noun, that we call that head noun, we call that the antecedent, right? Okay, and that it is through the relative pronoun, right? It's a pronoun, and pronouns have antecedents, right? So that relative pronoun replaces that. You can think of it as replacing that head noun. You know, it makes it that we don't have to write that head noun twice. So we've been through this a lot, right? Okay. So we usually expect when we have a relative clause that we're going to have a relative pronoun, right? And that relative pronoun is going to have a nominal antecedent, right? Because pronouns replace nouns, right? That's why we call it a relative pronoun. Relative because it introduces a relative clause. Fine. Now, this works differently, and we can think of this as being really exceptional in what we call sentence relatives or sentential relatives. Because the antecedent of a sentential relative is not nominal, right? It is the entire preceding clause, I should say. So I have to give you an example of that, right? Which means the function is going to be, you can already probably anticipate, which means the function is going to be a little bit different. It can't be a post modifier or noun phrase if the antecedent is not a noun. Okay, so that's what we're going to try to understand here. So I can invent a sentence. We're going to invent a sentence. We're going to say the plane flew away. And then I'm going to add some kind of a commentary about that thing happening, right? So I have the first sentence, the plane flew away, just a factual statement, no problem. And then I'm going to want to say something about that. And I can say, which was disappointing. Okay, so the plane flew away, which was disappointing. I apologize for my writing. I'm sure that is pretty difficult to read given the lighting situation. Well, we're doing what we can. Okay, so the plane flew away, comma. Notice we have this comma, which indicates that we have a sort of a hiatus between these two clauses, which was disappointing, right? So we might ask ourselves, what we have here. We have a relative clause, which was disappointing. Okay, right. Now, the idea here is, what is the antecedent for this relative clause? We can't really say that the plane is disappointing, right? Okay, that is not the scope, which does not replace the word plane, which is what would happen in a typical relative, right? When a relative is a post modifier. But here, this clause, which was disappointing, is a commentary on not just the noun phrase, right? But on the whole preceding clause. And we're saying something about the fact that the plane flew away. And usually you can use that paraphrasis, the fact that, right? Because the fact is it's a word, it's convenient, it's a word with a very, wide meaning that can kind of successfully sort of encapsulate the meaning of a whole clause, right? So I could say, the fact that the plane flew away was disappointing. And that can be sort of a useful tool if you're not really sure about sentence relatives, to say that can be a way to identify, the scope of that relative here, right? So here we can think of this, right, this can have sort of a value of commentary and as a sort of aside, similar to a non-restrictive relative, except that there is no nominal antecedent here. Okay, and always keep in mind, it's always nice to have a test, right? You'll almost always be able to rewrite this, right? And this is actually really good for your expressive capability. This whole idea of, if you're ever stuck with, you think you're saying too much of the fact that, try to reformulate that sentence, right, with a comma and then a sentence relative. This should hopefully, widen your, expressive potential. So we can say that the plane flew away, comma, which was disappointed, right? And we can say, the fact that the plane flew away was disappointing. And we would never be able to do that with the normal relative clause, right? Remember we said the woman who was walking down the street? We wouldn't say the fact that the woman was, it doesn't make any sense. It just falls apart, right? I couldn't really finish it. It just doesn't work. So hopefully you can say that's clear to you. Now, let's just be sure that let's ask ourselves questions about the structure and function. So it's still a relative clause, right? I mean, and notice when we're talking about the structure, we're only looking at, the words themselves, right? So we're going to call this a relative clause. That's the structure, right? We're going to S relative clause. So here we are, F here, function. And notice this is distinguished from a typical relative clause, which is part of a noun phrase, and it would be a post modifier. And as you hopefully can recall, when we talk about function, we said the difficulty in function is identifying sort of what we call the immediately superior structure. What we're saying is this relative is a part of what, right? And typically relative clauses are parts of noun phrases, right? And that noun phrase that ascribes the relevant function to the relative clause, right? Okay, so that means to find the appropriate function, we need to sort of be aware of the immediately superior structure, right? And we all know that noun phrases have the same structure. They always have determiner, pre-modifier, head noun, and post-modifier, right? Okay, so once we understand that a relative clause is a part of that noun phrase, right, we know that it's either going to be a determiner, a pre-modifier, a head noun, or a post-modifier. And it's always, once we figure that out, it is fairly obvious that it is in fact the post-modifier in that noun phrase. Okay, so this time, this will not work, right? Because we have just shown, right, and hopefully you've understood that this relative clause, which was disappointing, is not a part of that noun phrase. So the function is not going to be post-modifier, right? That doesn't make any sense, right? Because the function has to be, as we said, a part of the immediately superior structure, right? And the immediately superior structure with which was disappearing is not a noun phrase. So we might ask ourselves, what is the immediately superior structure? Well, we call it a sentence relative, right? And it's sort of the preceding sentence, if you will, right? And we've already seen this at work. And if you remember, we're basically saying something about this event, right? Notice, because we cannot narrow the scope of this relative to one individual noun, right? We're talking about the whole statement, right? Okay. In a sense, we could call it a statement relative, or if you prefer, right, or a clause relative. That wouldn't bother me if you called it that. I think perhaps someone else would be bothered by that, but that wouldn't bother me. Because that shows that you understood it. So we've seen this before, right? Remember when we've looked at functions, right? We've seen that there is a certain function, right? When we're talking about an event, and we want to give information about that event, remember that we call that an adverbial, right? And as a reminder, you're all aware of this. Remember, we really went to great lengths to make sure that you understand that we're always talking about function when you talk about adverbial. And this is what's really great, is that you have learned a lot about adverbials in French, because I know that des compléments circonstanciels de cause, de lieu, de temps, et ainsi de suite. Vous les avez bien vus je crois qu'en collège. Donc vous les connaissez bien. And adverbial, and if you remember, when you talk about complément circonstanciel, il peut s'agir même d'un groupe nominal, d'un groupe prépositionnel, d'un groupe adverbial, et ainsi de suite. Donc il y a plusieurs structures qui peuvent jouer le rôle de complément circonstanciel. D'accord. Donc ici, we've already seen, right? We've already seen that there are different. We've spent some time looking at adverbials, this function, and we've seen that yes, we can actually have a noun phrase being adverbial. For example, I'm going there next week. Next week, structure, noun phrase, function, adverbial. It's saying when I'm going, right? Okay, it's giving information about that event, right? Notice we've seen that we can have a prepositional phrase. I woke up in the morning, right? In the morning, I underline that structure, prepositional phrase, right? And the function, it's saying, once again, this is another time adverbial, complément circonstanciel de temps. This is yet another structure, right, that can perform that function of giving information about the event, right? And when we give information about the event, it's going to be information about time, place, manner, right? Which is why it's great that you've seen, time, place, manner, temps, manière, lieu, et ainsi de suite, when you have studied complément circonstanciel in your grammar classes. And you're good at this. We've seen that you're good at this. So here we have yet another case in an adverbial. We've already seen this. So it's a little bit exceptional because usually we think of relative clauses being post-modifiers, but they can be adverbials. So you can add this to our list of adverbials, right? And that is sort of the icing on the cake. It's the end of the semester. You've hopefully been able to, wrap everything up. So I hope that is fairly clear, and pay attention to this example that you will find on that test that you are going to practice on. And of course, the way that you know how to practice for the test is that you watch the videos, you study, you do the test yourself, and then you check, then you do it again and you check, right? You should hopefully really, that should be sufficient material for you to practice for our final assignment. So best of luck for the end of your semester. I enjoyed it. I am disappointed that we were unable to see each other for the end. It's a little bit sad that we are, so far away from each other, but I hope everything goes well and we will perhaps see each other next year. Take care.